Well, everyone seems very keen to talk about immigration today, and you expect to hear even more as the government, the Conservatives and Reform will all be making announcements on the topic in the coming week. After a disastrous recent local elections result for the Tories, can it help them fight back against Reform? Earlier I spoke to the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp. Chris Philp, your leader says that you would reverse any trade deal that Keir Starmer makes with the EU. You haven't seen the deal, so how do you know you want to trash it?
She's not said she'd reverse any trade deal. She said she would reverse a trade deal that crosses our red lines. That would include if a trade deal with the EU had things like a return to free movement, if it entailed making substantial or indeed any financial contributions, or indeed ceding control over regulation of our domestic economy. Now, if those red lines get crossed, a trade deal would get torn up, but that's not any trade deal. We've got our red lines, we've got our position.
Those are all generalisations. I mean, this is all a bit performative, isn't it? Wouldn't it just be better to wait and see?
Well, it's not performative at all. It's saying, look, there are these really important conditions that, were the British public expressed their view via that referendum a few years ago. We don't want to be making financial contributions to the EU. Most free trade deals do not involve making financial contributions from one party to another. Most free trade deals do not involve ceding sovereignty over how we decide to regulate our economy here in the UK. And it's completely reasonable for Kemi to say those are not lines we think should be crossed.
She grumbled about the deal with the Americans, but is that really right? Because she tried to get a deal with the Americans. I know she did, because she came in here and told us at the time, and you got nothing. Isn't it a bit graceless to complain when this government has actually got an agreement with the White House?
Well, to be clear, what we were trying to negotiate 4 or 5 years ago was a proper comprehensive trade deal. What was agreed last week is not a comprehensive trade deal. It's a very narrow deal, talking mainly about tariffs. Now, while it's welcome...
It's better than nothing, isn't it?
Well, while it's good that the terrible punitive tariffs that have been in place for a few weeks have been eased, as the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, said, the level of tariffs that are now being charged on UK exports going into America are higher under this new deal, so-called deal, than they were at the beginning of the year. So after all of Keir Starmer's crawling in the Oval Office and that sort of obscene obsequiousness we saw with Trump a few months ago, we're actually in a worse place today than we were on January the 1st, and I don't think that is a cause for celebration.
Steady on. Bailey said it was a decent platform, and if we're talking about obscene obsequiousness, your leader couldn't get closer to J.D. Vance. But the point I really want to make here is she said that we had been shafted. Now, is this really grown-up behaviour from the leader of the opposition?
Well, look, I think the point that she was making reasonably, and a point that Andrew Bailey, the Governor, did echo, is that the tariffs we are paying today for UK exports into the US, they are higher than they were on the 1st of January.
But they're not higher than anybody else, and competition is what matters here.
Well, they're higher by about a factor of 3. There's loads of countries that have got this 10% tariff, loads and loads of countries around the world. So we're no better off than any of them, despite all of Keir Starmer's fawning sycophancy, and we're worse off than we were a few months ago. And for Keir Starmer to claim this is some kind of huge success is obviously absurd.
That's just very interesting. You're using words like obsequiousness and sycophancy. Some people might say you're really cross with him because actually he's doing some of the things that you completely failed to achieve in 14 years.
Not remotely. As I say, our tariffs now are higher than they were a few months ago. And if you look at the economy, OK, we left office with the fastest growing economy in the G7. Inflation, let me finish the point, inflation was at the target level. And what did Rachel Reeves do? Having lied during the election campaign, she hit the UK economy with the biggest tax rises in a generation, as a result of which economic growth forecasts have been slashed. Our economy is now stagnating. Unemployment has been going up since the election, and inflation is above target, all thanks to Keir Starmer's appalling budget. That is the real economic story here.
OK, we're not at the House of Commons here, but we don't usually use
and it's Sunday morning.
We don't usually use the word lied on Sky News, so I'm sure that's not quite what you meant.
Well, I mean, they did say during the election campaign they weren't going to put up taxes, and then they put up taxes by the biggest amount for over 30 years.
All right.
And they called us liars when we warned about that during the election campaign, so I think that use of language is appropriate.
Let's talk about about your responsibility. You criticise the government for not being radical enough in its migration proposals, though we haven't actually seen the details. What is it that you want them to do that you could not have done in your 14 years in charge?
Look, so let me start with the last 14 years. I'm going to be very honest, Trevor, with you and your viewers. The last government made some very serious mistakes with immigration. They allowed it to be far, far too high. So let me start with just a very honest acknowledgement of that fact.
So Boris Johnson's record number, 900,000 net migration, that was
a mistake. That was a huge mistake, and that should not have been allowed to happen. So what are we proposing now to fix that going forward? Now, we've developed in opposition, under new leadership, some new specific and credible proposals. And I'm going to give you two examples of those. The first, and we're going to put both of these to a vote in Parliament tomorrow. Goodness me, tomorrow, my voice is going a bit. The first of those ideas is to have a vote on a binding annual cap on migration set by Parliament, and I would expect it to be at a far, far lower level than recently. So Parliament will democratically decide what that migration number is going to be. Now, that's the first thing we're going to put to a vote. Secondly, when it comes to removing people who are foreign criminals or people with no right to be here, very often they use spurious ECHR and human rights claims, which can be brought before UK courts. So secondly, we plan to repeal the entire Human Rights Act in relation to immigration matters. So no longer can people make these claims before UK courts. And I bet Labour will vote against that as well, because they voted against it in committee just a few weeks ago. So there are two specific, credible ideas to fix our country's immigration problems that we've developed and proposed. We're going to put them to a vote, and I'm pretty sure tomorrow Labour, who are not serious about fixing this, are going to vote against those ideas.
Well, we'll let Parliament decide whether they're credible or not, but let's just deal with them. On the issue of the family life, this derives from Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, and what you essentially want to do is to disapply the Human Rights Act when it comes to migrants.
But not just Article 8, all of it.
Oh, so is your point here that actually immigrants should not be treated as humans?
No, that's not my...
The Human Rights Act applies to all people because they are human.
So the problem with the Human Rights Act is that the clauses in the ECHR, as you know, as a former expert in this area, are very vaguely worded. So, for example, a right to a private and family life. Now, what does that actually mean? When we pass a law in Parliament, it's 200 pages long, often. It defines everything very precisely. The ECHR, by contrast, is very, very vague. And what has happened, unfortunately, over the years, but particularly the last 10 or 15 years, is judges have stretched these definitions to the point of being just defying common sense. I'll give you a concrete example. There was a Zimbabwe paedophile who should have been deported back to Zimbabwe under UK law, but a UK judge, using the Human Rights Act, said, no, if he goes back to Zimbabwe, he might face some hostility. And this dangerous paedophile has therefore been allowed to stay in the UK, where he might continue to offend. So I think, in terms of ensuring people's human rights are respected, let's rely on our UK Parliament, democratically elected, to pass laws that respect human rights, rather than letting judges endlessly expand these definitions.
What you're asking Parliament to do is to remove a group of people who are asylum seekers, immigrants of one kind or another, to remove their rights under the Human Rights Act. That's what you want to do.
I'm saying that for that group who have often entered the country illegally or are foreign citizens who have committed an offence, we should not be seeing them stay in this country under judges ever-expanding interpretations of human rights legislation which defy common sense. It should be for Parliament.
So when judges get it wrong, you just want to change the law.
I'm proposing to change the law so that Parliament decides where these lines are drawn, not judges who stretch the elastic further and further and further to the point that it defies common sense and we can't control our own borders. And that is not acceptable.
Chris Philp, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.